Now, the Eastern Cape Health Department is promising to take action against the father of a baby born to a 12-year-old. The girl gave birth at a Makhanda hospital yesterday. Now, to help us delve into the many facets of this case, we have a clinical psychologist, Dr. Kosijiane, and legal expert, Mr. Mpumelelo Zikalala. Very good evening to you both. Thank you for taking your time out to speak to us on this very important topic.
Good evening, and thank you. And such an unfortunate circumstance that we have to unpack this evening.
Yes. I'll start briefly with you, Mr. Zikalala, just to understand the legal aspects of the story. I think that'll help us frame the conversation that we'll have here today. I assume we're looking at a case of statutory rape. What does the law say in the context of the case that we're discussing here today of a child that is 12-year-old being impregnated by a 17-year-old?
The law is clear. You have the Criminal Amendment Act that came into effect in 2007 that says, even though you can say that you have consent, a person who is under the age of 17 and also within the age of 12 and 17 years old does not have the ability to give consent. So they don't know what they're going to be consenting about. They have no idea about the consequences which are going to be there. And if you are found guilty and there is evidence that says that there is sexual intercourse that has taken place, the law is very clear. You are going to be found guilty of statutory rape. And that is what I think should follow in this particular case, especially after a child has been born. So the law is very clear as to the age of consent, very clear as to what the age of consent should be, and what the consequences of those people that choose not to abide by it should be, in a sense that they should be found guilty and sent to jail.
Yeah, and the reason I ask you this initially is that there has been talk of waiting for this young man to turn 18 for them to be prosecuted. Is there any need for that? Or can the law just take its course at this particular time?
No. There would be no need for them to turn 18. In fact, criminal liability started at the age of 14, and it's up to the prosecution to then say a person who is not yet above the age of 18 does have criminal capacity to understand what they were doing. So the most important question should be, at the time of you committing the offense, did you understand that what you were doing is wrong? Most importantly, we were able to act in accordance with what is required, whether to follow that particular correct or wrongful act. If the answer to that is yes, then the person has full criminal liability and they can be able to stand trial and be able to be found guilty. It may act as a mitigating circumstance at a later stage, but in terms of the person being found guilty, then definitely, if all the elements have been proven, the guilty verdict is going to apply. It's only in the sentencing part in which where the age will then be considered.
Yeah, and one can't help but wonder, Dr. Gianni, what happens in the psyche of a 12-year-old girl who has to go through, I think the period of pregnancy, even for a fully grown woman, it can be very stressful, not only on the mind, but on the body as well. How, just from your experience, what kind of emotional state do you think a 12-year-old would be going through at a time like this?
I think there's a multiple, it's a multiple layered circumstance, in the sense that, firstly, what was her understanding of what was going on in her body? So, and the fact that, at least in the Limpopo case, that, they were not aware of her being pregnant until 8 months, just to have to go through that alone is a second burden that she would have had to carry throughout this period, and then to also be confronted with what it means for her future, and to have to deal with all of this on her own. But I think, we are dealing with a consequence here, because it tells a story, a very sad and stark story of a child that has been let down by family and by society. So it is an indictment on all of us as a society. It talks really to the moral decay that permeates our society at this stage. It is a scathing indictment on us, indeed. Yeah,
and when you speak of these children being let down by society and all the adults around them, it takes me back, and perhaps Mr. Zikalala, you can help us understand this. What responsibility do the healthcare workers, the parents, the guardians of these children have? If they haven't reported this case, clearly they have known about it. I'm sure there's part of the Sexual Offences Act that says they have to make a report to the authorities. What kind of charges could they face for not doing so?
Definitely, there could be hidden contravention of, I think, Section 54 of the Sexual Offences Act that says if you know about it, it's not a choice whether you want to or not, whether you like to or not, you are obligated to report about it, whether you're a practitioner or not a health practitioner. Now, in this case, let's be clear, it will also include the parents that would have known that something like this is taking place and the relatives that would have known. If they haven't reported anything about it, then that would be part and parcel and become individuals that would have broken the law in terms of the Sexual Offences Act. So it's important for those that come to knowledge of this. It's even worse for health practitioners because there's also a Health Practitioners Act that provides a whole host of things and obligations in which they need to report. So for them, the consequences might be a lot dire because there are a number of legislation that has been contravened. But it's not only for them. The parents are also in the mix. The relatives are also in the mix to say, if you have knowledge of anything that is taking place, and you are aware of the person's age, and you're aware that the person is fallen pregnant, and you're aware that there's reasonable presumption that the person would have been raped statutorily, then it is an obligation upon you to go and report. If you don't do it, then you may be liable for a fine or for a sentence which is not more than 5 years.
Yeah, but do you think it's a case of ignorance from these parents and guardians who do not report? Because I don't see quite a number of these cases in our criminal justice system being prosecuted of parents that are just really not doing their due diligence when it comes to protecting their children.
Maybe let me start with parents. Maybe it would be a case of ignorance. It would be a case of a person saying that I feel ashamed that I have a child that is falling pregnant at such a young age, but there's no excuse according to the law. When it comes to health practitioners, it's a lot more worse when it comes. But it also poses the question that Dr. Gianna referred to. It is not a case of something that can be dealt with by law enforcement or legislative provisions only. It is a community problem that needs a community basis, that needs the help of all individuals that are there. That includes the parents, the community, even the kids themselves being taught what it means to be raped statutory. What's the age of legal consent? What does it mean to engage in those sexual preferences and in those sexual acts and the consequences which are going to follow? So it's something which is a way lot deeper. And after that is being said, it can't be that the law is the only system or the only response it is going to be, or that the response is going to be let's send somebody to jail and let's hope that the problem is going to go away. If we continue with that trajectory, then we're not going to get the results that we desire. It is a community problem and it requires community results.
Dr. Gianni, are communities ready to deal with such? I know there's issues of patriarchy in our homes, especially in some of the family setups that we have, that these issues just need to be discussed within the family and don't need to be reported to the police.
That is unfortunately many times the case where the family, one doesn't want to be embarrassed and to be shamed for this situation, and then people kind of, tend to downplay it and hush it and treat it within the family and contain it within the family, which is part of actually victimizing the victim even further. Because I think to Mr. Zikalala's point, this is a symptom of how far down the moral decay has gone in our societies. And I think it is very much, a common thing for us to be dismayed, to be shocked at this point. But this wasn't a first incident or encounter between these two people that they met and she fell pregnant on that day and we got to find out. There was some sort of contact between them, between this at the beginning and where we are today. And the question is, what has happened in between that? Didn't anybody see what was going on here? Surely somebody must have known. And in most of these instances, and I'm not sure if this is the case here, some parents are only too happy to have an adult stepping in and parenting a child and doing things for them, and they kind of buy into this situation rather than to intervene very decisively against it.
Yeah.
And so again, it is, the moral decay and the extent to which when you think it doesn't get worse, it certainly seems to be doing so.
Certainly a lot happens between the period that a child falls pregnant, even engages in sexual activity, and by the time that they give birth. I want us to see, and when it comes to statutory rape as well. Dr. Gianna, I'd like for us to pick up our conversation. The South African Schools Act now allows for pregnant teens, underage mothers to continue with their schoolwork. What are your thoughts around that? Is it a conducive environment for a young mother to go back to an environment where they can possibly be bullied. And I'm sure we know what happens at schools. Children can be very cruel at times. Do you think that is the right way to go?
You know, it is such a tricky situation because I certainly have spent 5 years. I spent 5 years working in schools in rural northern KwaZulu-Natal in the Mpumelelo district. And, you know, there was very much a dilemma around this because on the one hand, you know, there's a thing against, there's concern around normalizing kids being pregnant in school. And by the same token, the other dilemma becomes, why does the girl get punished that she has to be, you know, told to stay away from school while the boy, who sometimes, not always, would be also a learner, is allowed to continue. And so there's always, it's not an easy one to deal with. There certainly is something to be said about the fact that the question is around, how does the child continue schooling without necessarily perhaps being exposed and being put in a normal school? Because it does, you know, dilute the definition of a school as such and the definition of a child being at school. When you then start turning a school into a place that has a combination of, you know, learners who are pregnant, it starts to dilute and it creates an unpleasant or an unhealthy precedent for what it means and the kind of behavior that is expected of learners at that age and the focus on education. But equally so, it does point a finger very much so at the kinds of homes and the lack of parenting that is taking place. So we have unparented children who become themselves parents, a responsibility that they are not ready for, certainly not physically and definitely not psychologically and emotionally as well. So it's quite a big problem. And I think it is time that we move from the sensationalism of, you know, the birth on Christmas Day and rather focus on the scourge, which has been going on in our societies for way too long. And it has become normalized to the point that people are not horrified anymore. It's just part of, except these exceptional cases, which, you know, as we know that a lot of the children that were born on Christmas Day and New Year's were born to teens, which is an indictment all on its own.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate that, you know, these cases only get amplified when it comes to the end of the year. But this is something that happens throughout the year where these children are giving birth. Mr. Zikalala, there's an issue of the two acts. One of the Sexual Offences Act that we spoke about already, that people are obliged, adults are obliged to report cases of underage sex. And then there's the Children's Act that speaks of confidentiality regarding the health status of children. Is there a clash when it comes to those two laws, or is there an exception when there's a crime that has been committed?
That's when the exception applies, because as a health practitioner, your defense is going to be, I was obligated as to the Criminal Law Amendment Act to report this part of activity that has taken place, and I was certainly doing that so that I don't find myself in trouble. When it comes to the disclosure that is referred to in the Children's Act, it applies to third persons, and it applies to persons that are not supposed to receive that information. So if you report to a law enforcement agency, that particular individual or official is supposed to receive it, you're not going to find yourself in trouble. But however, if you report to a relative, if you report to a local chief, a local councillor, or a person who is not designated to receive information or can act upon it so that the other part of the station can then be able to apply, it's something that you can then find yourself in trouble. But I think what it does speak to is a bigger problem that applies, and which, unfortunately, this time the law does not seem to be able to address it fully. The one that says, what can we do as a community to be able to sit back and say, let's fix this problem from the root so that we're able to apply it. Holding things like what you've seen being administered by the KZN Department of Health, like Isbaya Samadol, all those community-based type of activities, making sure that there's information sharing from one person to another, from one stakeholder to another, is what is required here. Because if we apply the stick approach of saying that, let's take you to court, we're not going to achieve what we want to achieve. What's going to be achieved, though, is that the potential father or the father of this child is going to be sent to jail, won't be able to work so that they're able to maintain it, won't be able to have visiting rights because they will be in jail, that means you're going to have a child who is going to grow for the better part of their infant life without knowing what a person who is a father should be. And the stigma that's always going to be to say that, yes, you are my father, but you were sent to jail for you because you brought me into this earth. So there are a lot more consequences that are there, which I think maybe we should take a sit back and say, there are going to be instances where pure criminal activities are going to be made, but let's think about this innocent child and see what can we do in order to prevent this thing from taking place. And when it does happen, what can we do in order to make sure that the child grows up in a normal environment, is able to appreciate all the other elements that are there.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing from you is that the existing laws and policies have just not been enough in trying to deter would-be rapists and just protecting children from indulging in these kind of acts that are obviously harmful to them. What are the loopholes? And you'll forgive me if you've already mentioned that, but I know you touched on certain organizations and other things that can be done to plug in those gaps.
What the loopholes is to say, what are the socio-economic activities which are taking place that are forcing these young girls from engaging with older men? If there's anything that you do with poverty, fix that rather than making sure that and creating a law which is going to punish individuals. But more at the same breath, punish those individuals who are going to say, I'm 30, 40 years of age and I have a girlfriend who is 20 or even 15 years of age, because I have a much better understanding on how things are supposed to be. I have a much better understanding of the consequences that are going to follow if the person gets pregnant. So punish that individual. But in doing so, think about the innocent child which is going to be born and make sure that you're able to come back and say, what can we do in order for this child to grow up in a caring environment, for this child to grow up in an environment in which the mother and the father are both going to be there. It then says, let's take a step back and says, the mechanisms that we have now, for example, the Criminal Law Amendment Act 2007, are they working optimally? Are they acting as a deterrent? If the answer is no, let's find other solutions which are going to work, other solutions which are going to place us as better community members in order in securing the future of a girl child and the future of the babies which are going to be born out of those girl children.
Yeah, a lot of work still needs to be done, clearly. Dr. Gianni, the long-term effects of these kind of cases, teen pregnancies, statutory rape, on not only the mother, but also on the boys that are involved in this, seemingly if it's children of the same age, socioeconomic issues, literacy issues, some of them have to leave school, and just it becomes an unbroken cycle of poverty and all sorts of things that encompass that.
Yeah, it is it's a very comprehensive, multi-layered and complex transgenerational scourge. And we have to take not just a throwing the book at the problem and punishing from a legal point of view, as Mr. Zikalala has said. We need to have a much more broad and very focused, deliberate approach to the issue that starts at the family, which this case serves to indicate that there is a brokenness from which this breakdown comes from. And we need to be very vigilant. And as a government, for example, to say that we have to do more than just giving grants. It is not enough to just give grants. Social development has to be about ensuring that we enhance the development of our communities, of our families, rather than, again, just throwing money at the issue and, letting things go as they do at the moment. But we need to really sit down and have a much more focused discussion that looks at how do we look after children from the beginning, as Mr. Zikalala has indicated in this case. By just throwing the person in jail, you are contributing to the scourge continuing. While we are not saying, by the same token, that there should not be consequences to these sorts of things, we need to think quite comprehensively about what those need to look like, in the sense that, on the one hand, there needs to be some form of sanction, but on the other, there needs to be some form of correction and development that takes place in both the the parents' lives, and more importantly, so in this child's life, so that we give this child the best chance at life, so that this cycle does not continue to move on to the next generation.
Absolutely, multifaceted solutions required here. I appreciate the both of you for joining us in this conversation. Thank you so much for your insights. We'll have to leave it there for now. Dr. Kosijian is a clinical psychologist. We also had our legal expert in speaking to us, Mr. Mpumelelo Zikalala. Very good evening to both of you.